About on Tuesday, the last midterm primary elections, the 2022 cycle, were held in Delaware, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. And as in other primaries, a number of Trump-backed House and Senate congressional candidates won big. That came, though, as Republicans and Democrats alike were surprised when GOP Senator Lindsey Graham revealed his plans for a 15-week federal abortion ban.
I think we should have a law at the federal level that would say after 15 weeks, no abortion on demand, except in cases of rape, incest, to save the life of the mother.
Democrats immediately fired back.
So to anyone who thought they were safe, who thought, I'm in a blue state, I'll be fine, here is the painful reality. Republicans are coming after your rights.
Meanwhile, on Tuesday at the White House, President Biden held a celebration for the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Yet, a worse than expected inflation report was released hours before the event that led many Republicans to pointedly criticize the president. And finally, because there was, as I said, a lot of news, also dominating the headlines this week, Republican governors flying migrants to Democrat-led cities. Ron DeSantis of Florida flew migrants to the popular vacation island of Martha's Vineyard, and Greg Abbott of Texas left asylum seekers outside the Vice President Kamala Harris's Washington, D.C. home. So, Susan, back to you before I jump to Zolan, because I want to bring you in, too. I want to ask you about the primaries. We saw New Hampshire, a Trump-backed candidate, beat out yet again. The story happened all over the country, a Republican establishment candidate. I wonder what you make of that race and also what it's just told us about this primary season.
You know, it happened in New Hampshire, it happened in Maryland, it happened in Arizona, it happened in Vermont. The Trumpiest candidate in these contested primaries is the one that wins the nomination. And what does that tell us? It tells us that Donald Trump continues to have enormous sway over the Republican Party, and the argument that he's backing less electable candidates does not convince Republican primary voters to walk away from his legacy and his approach to politics.
Zolan, you're nodding your head. Jump in here.
No, absolutely. I mean, just because Trump's not on the ballot doesn't mean Trumpism is not on the ballot. And as you were saying, you know, the idea that we're still, even at this midterm election, still in these elections, in these primaries, basically litigating who the rightful president is, and at the point still having candidates who are outright denying some of the results of the previous election, says a lot about where we are right now with our democratic system and our political discourse as well.
It's head spinning. And Mariana, of course, you're at the center of it covering Congress. Now, there was some interesting reporting. You had Nancy Pelosi saying not only are Democrats going to hold on to control of the House, they're going to win and expand their majority. But Punchbowl News, our friends at the newsletter, they say that behind closed doors, Chuck Schumer is saying that Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats are in trouble. What are you hearing?
I'm hearing exactly that. Many people were wondering why Pelosi was so optimistic. You definitely felt on the House side, this is the first week that they came back after a 6-week recess, you definitely felt the upbeat mood that Democrats were feeling. And it came after Senator Graham, and also there was a companion bill in the House that was introduced, that federal ban that they think, you know, when we're talking about being on the campaign trail, talking about making a difference between Democrats and Republicans, well, this is the extreme MAGA Republicans who are just going to take away more of your freedom. So they were feeling that energy, but many people were that I've talked to, both members, aides, thinking maybe Pelosi was feeling too much of that energy. One thing to know, of course, during that press conference, she got asked if she wants to still stay in leadership, regardless of what happens in November. A lot of aides and a couple of members that I talked to yesterday as well, thinking, you know, you can't say and project negativity that you might lose the majority, that you may not keep all these seats, that it might be a blowout. So that is likely a bit of where that's coming from on Pelosi's end.
And Mariana, you touched on it, but of course, Lindsey Graham, he introduced this federal ban on abortions after 15 weeks. What motivated him to do this at this exact time, and how are Republicans and Democrats responding to it?
You know, he was asked that question during that press conference that you played, and he simply said, it's the women standing behind me. Those are a number of women who are heads of pro-life groups, anti-abortion groups, and they for a while have been pushing him and also Chris Smith, a Republican on the House side, to update this legislation that Chris Smith has actually been reintroducing Congress after Congress after Congress that would put a federal ban in place. It went from 20 weeks to 15 weeks. But, even Lindsey Graham said, I didn't talk to McConnell about this. I really haven't talked to my colleagues about this either. And you heard the repercussions of that. Many Republicans saying, why are we talking about this right now? It's not necessarily an issue that we want to be talking about because we don't have the upper hand at the moment. Let's focus instead on, the fact that Biden is holding an event on the Inflation Reduction Act at a time when we're still seeing inflation on the rise. None of that helped Republicans as they tried to regain the narrative ahead of the midterms elections.
Susan, you've been covering the issue of women's rights and politics for so long. What do you make of what Lindsey Graham just did here? And what are you hearing? Because the word on the street is that Republicans were looking at Lindsey Graham like, excuse me, why? Why are you doing this?
If Republicans lose control of the Senate, which now seems entirely, fail to gain control of the Senate, which now looks entirely possible, it will be their own fault. It will be the self-inflicted wounds, including Lindsey Graham raising the issue of a national abortion ban after many Republicans argued the real point of supporting the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade was it's an issue that we should leave to the states. Well, this is the reverse of that. Nominating candidates that are to the farthest right in some of these contested Senate races, where it's not the strongest possible Republican candidate who could have been nominated, letting the conversation not be focused squarely on inflation, which is and now crime, their best issues. If Republicans don't do well, as well as we expected them to do a month or 2 months ago, they're going to have themselves to blame.
And Zolan, I want to bring you in because I know we're talking about abortion, but the other big issue here were these migrants being flown all over the country, and you've covered immigration better than almost any reporter that I know. So I want to ask you about this. The White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, she said, quote, of this, they've used them like political pawns, treated them like chattel in a cruel, premeditated political stunt. What do you make of what we're seeing here and the repercussions, the political sort of implications of all this, but also the human toll? I'm thinking about migrants who are coming to the country fleeing violence and finding themselves dropped off in random cities.
Yeah, I think it's important to describe who these people are, right? I mean, many Venezuelans, many South Americans who are fleeing violence, but also poverty, right, that are coming to the country, many of which, even if they haven't started the process yet, were told by their lawyers likely to seek asylum. This tactic isn't, while it has been used to retaliate against Democrats, just to give you an idea of how once taboo it is, go back to November 2018 and the Trump administration, and you have a Stephen Miller-led effort to basically go and try and pressure ICE officials at the time to basically do this on the federal level. Take migrants at the border, bring them to San Francisco to retaliate against Nancy Pelosi, other cities to retaliate against Democrats. Just to give you an idea of how polarizing this is, Matt Albence at the time, deputy director of ICE, I don't think I'd be challenged to find anyone who would say he is soft on immigration, says, no, we can't do this. He basically rejected that proposal out of concerns, out of liability for the safety of those migrants by doing this, as well as saying that the budget didn't appropriate, that ICE didn't have the authority to essentially do that. Now you have states doing it themselves, and it really does show you both the tactic that we've seen before congressional elections, Republicans leaning into anti-immigrant sentiment to try and galvanize a base, but also it just doesn't solve the overall issue at hand, which is a broken immigration system. Democrats and Republicans would say that, but this doesn't solve the issue at hand whatsoever, which is a backlog court system and a lack of consistency when it comes to the border.
And it's so striking that you're saying that this tactic was seen as just too out there for the Trump administration, and now it's sort of being normalized.
In fact, look at 1962. It was a tactic used by white citizen councils in the South to convince African Americans, blacks, to get on buses and go to northern places, including Hyannisport, where the president had a summer house. This is not the kind of historical comparison that Governor DeSantis should be wanting to make.
And Mariana, in the last minute we have here, I know it's Hispanic Heritage Month. You've been talking to Latino voters about sort of how both parties are trying to get at them and trying to win their votes. We only have about a minute left, but please talk to me a little bit about your reporting and how it connects to all of this, especially as we're thinking about inflation and all the other things, but also immigration.
Yeah, this is the first election since 2020 where we saw Democrats lose drastically a solid base in South Florida, also along the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And Democrats have been making many more investments, historic investments, incorporating a number of Latino operatives to advise a number of campaigns starting earlier than usual, but Republicans have already been there for some time. So a lot of Democrats I've been talking to say, you know what, it's good that we're laying the ground now. Finally, they're listening to us. However, it might take some time to actually see those voters come back. Latinos still tend to vote Democratic, but Republicans very much making gains. And you're seeing many more Republican Hispanic women and men run for office, which is also an appeal, allowing a lot of these voters to say, oh, look, there's Republicans in the party who look like me. Maybe I can be open to them. And there's the issues of course, economy and how that affects both men, women, different generations, that is really going to make an interesting story
Certainly.
post midterm election about our communities.
Certainly. Well, thank you to our panel for joining us and for sharing your reporting.